This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by my favorite insulin pump ever, the OmniPod. The podcast is also sponsored today by the tool that, I'm just going to come out and say it, is really half of the reason that Arden's A1C is where it is, Dexcom. I'm telling you what, continuous glucose monitoring is the way to go. I'm about to lose my mind. Owen.
Howdy.
Owen, good morning.
Good morning.
You're one of my fastest turnaround from, hey, I'd like to be on the podcast to recording the podcast ever.
Yeah, it's really fast.
Technology's great. Makes things easy. I thought your idea for a topic was really great. So I just start, and then we'll just follow the conversation and see where it goes, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Cool. Just introduce yourself the way you would like to be known. Welcome to episode 96 of the Juicebox Podcast. Boy, the title of this one is going to really tease you because this one's with Owen, but Owen just got a Dexcom CGM like a week before we spoke, so we spend like the first part of the show talking about management before we actually get to his topic. And what's the topic today? Well, let me just tell you the title of this episode. It's called Owen Gets Hit by a Car. And that's not the only crazy surprise that Owen tells me about. He's in a band. His mom was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes after he was. Stay tuned, kids. This episode's a little crazy.
So I'm Owen. I live in Michigan, and I've been diabetic since September 9th, 1996.
He's 16, 10 years.
Yeah.
You are, I don't want to, I'm guessing, but you were diagnosed about 16 days after my daughter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she was right after her second birthday in August of 2006. It just struck me when you said that. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's funny how you know the date.
So 10 years with type 1 diabetes. How old are you now?
I'm 32 last time I checked.
30. I can't remember my age, so
Yeah, I'm at the point where I have to actually start calculating and carrying over the one and stuff like that.
I spent an entire delightful year of my life a couple years ago believing I was a year younger than I was. And I have to admit, it didn't change anything. It just made me happy. So I highly recommend it for anyone, honestly. How do you, 10 years ago, what'd you get? Like a little 4-cent freestyle meter and some needles and some Novolog? What'd they give you?
Oh, actually, I think this would have been 20 years ago. 96. So that, yeah.
Oh, geez, what am I doing? My math is, wait a minute, 96, 2000. Wait, so you've had diabetes for 20 years?
Right.
Oh, so again, Owen, I don't know how many of the past episodes you've listened to, but people who have listened to the podcast for a long time are going to go, this is where Scott's going to mention how bad his math skills are. So my daughter has not been alive for 20 years, Owen. You were polite to keep going with the conversation.
Well, I hadn't even done the calculation until you just mentioned it again. So.
Let's start over. We'll play the music.
I was ready to go with 10 years,
Let's play the music again. We'll start the whole podcast over. And we'll say that Owen's had type 1 diabetes since he was, 12 years old?
Yeah, 12 years old.
20 years ago. 10 years and about 16 days before my daughter was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Let's stop talking about numbers and math right now. And you know what it proves, really? That math must not be that important in the day-to-day management of diabetes, because I do a really good job with my daughter, and I can't do, obviously, I didn't know 1996 was 20 years ago. So anyway.
It helps to have a machine that does all this for you. So
It certainly does. It certainly does. So 20 years ago, wow, that's a different game, right? How were you taught to manage when you were 12 years old 20 years ago?
So I was diagnosed. I used to live in Texas, and this would have been a hospital in East Texas. And at the hospital that I was diagnosed at, it was kind of an old school calorie counting and just plain old insulin dosing kind of training. Mm-hmm. Like, I wouldn't really call it training. It was like you get kind of the run through. You watch like at that point what would have been like a 10 or 20-year-old video, maybe on Laserdisc or something, and then, but they did refer us to a specialist, an endocrinologist in Dallas. So I went to Dallas and got much more educated that way. Wow. But back in that time, I was probably using regular N as the long-term insulin and regular R for that fast-acting mealtime injections.
But that's interesting. So even the place where you were diagnosed, who gave you tools, still had to send you somewhere different to get more education.
Right. I think it has a lot to do with probably what we'll be discussing soon is the way the hospitals are set up for diabetes care and education. Well, there's not one universal program, so they're kind of on their own when it comes to that. And at this point in 1996, I don't know if a type 2 diabetic would have even received different information from what I got. It was basically like, sugar's bad. I remember there was a green printout that had a list of types of food and like how many carbs, or maybe it was calories that they had, and then it was just some kind of rudimentary, if you eat this much, take that much kind of training.
Wow. Okay. So do you use different technology? Obviously you use different technology now, but what are you managing with at the moment?
Right now I'm using an OmniPod, which I've had for probably around 9 months or so. Okay. And last week I got a CGM. I got the Dexcom G5.
Oh, wow. Did you have an insulin pump before the OmniPod?
No, before that I was on the pen needles.
Oh, wow. So you were 19 years doing just multiple daily injections, no glucose monitor. Now you have an insulin pump and the CGM. You've warped forward, obviously. What's the difference been like for you? Was the transition was it smooth? Was it frustrating at times?
The transition for me was actually pretty smooth. Read through the training information, watched a couple videos for the OmniPod, and I was using the OmniPod as my meter too, so that made it kind of streamline things a little bit. So that was useful, and so I think I got the hang of it pretty quickly.
Wow, that's great. How would you characterize how you use the glucose monitor? Are you using it as alarms to kind of tell yourself when something's going wrong, or are you using it to try to keep your blood sugar in a certain space?
I'm trying to be a good diabetic, so I would check before every meal. And I think the reason I got the CGM was before I received the CGM, I was not confident all the time at like what my blood sugar. Sometimes you can, like when your blood sugar is really under control, you can tell when it's going up or down. Like just internally, you kind of know what's happening.
You're able to feel your blood sugar as it kind of vacillates around.
Right, like I would feel if it was 120 and going down, I could kind of feel that, mm-hmm. and know that I was, I'd check my blood sugar, it would be 120 or so, or 80 or 90, and then I would know that it was falling a little bit, but based on the way I was feeling. But then if you get a cold or stress or all these other things that happen, then it kind of throws off your kind of detective system. So,
I gotcha.
So that's one thing I think that's been really helpful. So what was happening before I got the CGM was I would feel like my blood sugar was low. I would check it and it wasn't, or I'd feel like it was high and it would be not that high. So, so I was also curious what was happening with the food after I'd eat it and kind of when the insulin was acting. Because it was this thing where if you're not pre-bolusing, which was kind of a new concept to me recently, if you're not pre-bolusing and you eat a meal, and you kind of follow the instructions and take your Novolog after the meal, then you'll feel great for a little while. Then after, a couple of hours, your blood sugar is spiking. And if you don't have a CGM, you don't really realize that.
Yeah, I genuinely believe that the advent of close to real-time glucose monitoring and being able to see it constantly has changed the idea from, you'll count your carbs, you give yourself this much insulin, your blood sugar is probably going to go all over the place, but you won't die today. And, you'll get to live as much of your life as possible. And hopefully that'll mean a long time. And I think it's now switched to, with less effort than you may have been putting in before, you might be able to keep your blood sugar in as good of a range as everybody else has theirs in.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating what this one step in technology has done. Being able to just to be able to see where it's headed and to be able to make kind of like micro adjustments to it. And I guess you could do it with injections, but you'd be probably injecting yourself a lot. But the pump idea is just to be able to put in a tiny bit more insulin. Like my daughter's blood sugar this morning, she got up, it was 135, and she's been getting high in the mornings for school. And the first week I thought it was I did see like school anxiety the first few days. Then she got a cold, which I didn't know about for a couple of days. So I think the anxiety went away. Then we moved into a cold, and then the cold went away. And now I'm like, wow, I think her basal rates need to be adjusted. So this morning I sent her to school with a 30% increased temp basal and was just as aggressive with the morning time blood sugars as I had been days before, but with no luck. Before I was hitting 140s and they were staying at 140. I ended up giving her way more insulin than I needed to, and she'd just sit at 140. And so today, with the 30% increase in her basal, I bolused for the 140, and she's 89 right now, and nice and steady. And so this is just something that on MDI, I don't even know where you would begin to make that adjustment. I think what would happen is you would just go, well, 140 is not that bad, and you'd probably just go with it. So I'm very grateful for it, and I like that you're onto it too. So what made you switch? Because 20 years is a long time. I have a friend I talk about every once in a while on the abstract mic. He made a switch to different technology, but it was difficult for him to change what he was doing because of how long he had been doing it. Did you find that, or it sounds like no, maybe?
By the time I switched, so if you rewind a little bit, back in around 2010 or so, the thing is here in America, your insurance abilities are based on your job. So I had the ability where I was kind of flirting with switching to an Omnipod time, and then left the job, a few months later after that process was started. So wound up not switching to the Omnipod and just sticking with pins and needles, for the next 5 years or 6 years or so. So now I'm at a good job. I've been there long enough that I feel comfortable, and I've got, decent enough healthcare insurance that I can afford, to switch over. So, and there was this weird thing. I've mostly been listening to your podcast, from people that work at these companies, but I've heard you mention a couple of things, and I think communication with your endocrinologist is one of those things that's kind of tricky, because it all depends on the personality of the person you're talking to. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason, my endocrinologist, from my recollection, which may be flawed, the first time I mentioned a pump or something, my understanding was that he was kind of down on the idea. Mm-hmm. That he was like, it's not going to solve all the problems or something like that. And but then I think after another year or so after I brought it up again, because I was doing more research on my own and kind of trying to sort out things, I was really getting frustrated with the morning blood sugars, because I would either eat a snack at night before bed and then wake up with super high blood sugars, or not eat a snack, then wake up with low blood sugar in the middle of the night, and then wake up with really high blood sugars no matter what I did almost. And so I was really looking forward to switching to a different way of managing, diabetes. And so whenever I brought it up the second time, he was like, oh yeah, it's a great idea. So I think the first time it was one of those misunderstandings or something where it just, either he wasn't understanding what I was asking, or I didn't phrase it in the right way, but it's just one of those little kinks in the whole process of making changes.
There's a lot of little kinks, like I never would have thought until you said it a minute ago that you didn't want to move on to technology that may have been more expensive because you didn't feel settled at your job right away. Like even just that idea hadn't occurred to me. And it's interesting that you might accept something you don't even want just because you're like, well, I don't want to get started with this whole thing, then find out this job doesn't work out, and then I have to lose it again. Because I think that can be terrible to sometimes to see the other side and then have it taken away from you might be worse than having never seen it.
Right.
So that's really something. But okay, so is there something that facilitated your switch over? Just it didn't. There was no big moment in life. It was time, and you did it.
I think it was mostly had to do with I wasn't really bothered with injecting insulin, but I think what was really starting to kind of wear on me was the morning blood sugars. I would wake up and they would just be high every morning, and I couldn't figure out a way to stop that, and it was just a guessing game.
Where on you physically or where on you intellectually? Like, were you just like, I'm tired of this fight, or did you feel...
Both. I mean, when you wake up and your blood sugar is, 300 or something every day, and at least 200, then, and I mean, it's really wrong to be celebrating a blood sugar that's under 150 when you wake up, because you just feel bad the whole time, and you don't. I mean, once you're on that level of blood sugar for a long period of time, it's really a roller coaster, because you're taking a corrective dose in the morning, then later on during the day you get a good blood sugar, then you eat, and if you don't have a CGM, you don't really realize how it's kind of jumping up and down after that the rest of the day. But trying to sort out the morning blood sugars, and also just trying to keep a tighter control of it. My A1C had been going up as well. I was up into the 8s for a while.
Fair to say the last 9 months have been better?
Yes, much better.
Yeah. Well, and so how do you wake up now? Hey, the Dexcom G5 Mobile Continuous Glucose Monitoring System is the first FDA-approved device to let you make treatment decisions without pricking your finger. Just think about what that means. Sure, less finger sticks, but that's just the beginning. The future is now, baby! To begin managing your type 1 diabetes with the same great technology that has helped us to keep Arden's A1C between 5.8 and 6.2 for over 3 years, visit www.dexcom.com/juicebox or click on the link in the show notes. Oh, you know what? I nearly forgot to read the disclaimer. Hold on. I'm going to go deep voice. Finger sticks are still required for calibration, or if your symptoms or expectations do not match readings, or when taking medications containing acetaminophen. Go to dexcom.com/juicebox to find out more. Now let's talk about, that's right, the OmniPod. The world's only tubeless insulin pump, sure, but my only tubeless insulin pump, more importantly. When you hear me talking about making these fine adjustments, or Arden going out and playing softball in the heat for, 5 games in a row in the middle of July, she's wearing an Omnipod during that. She's always wearing an Omnipod. Arden's been using Omnipod since she was 4, before she even went to school. We didn't want to send Arden to school with injections, and so we needed, we thought we needed an insulin pump. We made that decision back then just for such simple reasons, right? Like, we don't want our kid to go to school and have to get injections from a stranger. But, in the ensuing years, all that insulin pumping has brought to us, was really just never imagined by us in the beginning. So I'm kind of asking you to do the same thing for a minute. When you think about getting an insulin pump right now, wonder to yourself, what does that mean to me? But understand that after you make the switch, an entire world that you don't know exists opens up. I always talk about the Dexcom and how it helps Arden's A1C stay where it is, but Omnipod has a huge, huge part in that as well. Okay, you want to go to myomnipod.com/juicebox. And what they're going to do is they're going to send you a non-functioning, but, exact replica demo pod so you can try it on and see if you like it. Then you can just decide, is this for me, before you even go ahead with it. It's simple. Just go to myomnipod.com/juicebox or click on the link in your show notes, and you can get started today with the same great insulin pump that my daughter uses.
Now I wake up in the mid 100s usually. This morning I woke up around 200, but not really sure why. I didn't have any snacks or anything overnight. So I'm also, now that I have the CGM, I'm getting a better idea of what types of food process differently overnight.
Yeah, for sure. There's so much information that comes back from the glucose monitor. It's almost, I try to absorb it in a very unconscious way. You know what I mean? Like I don't sit and I don't have that kind of mind to begin with, but I don't sit down and cognitively say this happened and then this happened. Like I get, it's hard to put into words really. Like I just have a feeling for what happens and what's going. Like last night, Arden lost a notebook 2 weeks into the school year, and she's like, I got to go get a new notebook. So I took her to like an office store and we grabbed the notebook. And then I was like, well, as long as we're out here at the shopping center, like I need to grab something at like a home store. I grabbed something here. And she's like, I have to get a book at Barnes & Noble. And then I was at Barnes & Noble. And she says, I want to get an iced tea lemonade at Barnes & Noble. And I was like, okay. So I've never been with her when she's done this. This always seems to be something that happens with her and my wife. And so the woman's, the girl at the counter, she makes the iced tea and she goes, sweet or unsweetened? And I'm not saying anything. And Arden's like, sweetened. And I was like, okay. So I gave her, it was this little medium cup, a little plastic cup. It had a lot of ice in it. I don't know how much, I had no idea how much sugar the girl was going to put. I didn't know what was going on. I was like, all right, so while she's making that, crank up your basil. I'd given her a little bit of insulin going into the store because I knew something was going to happen at that little counter. And then I just sort of randomly gave her like 4 units. I was like, 4 units should do it. Like that's how I felt. Like I was like, okay. And she's like, Mom usually gives me 3. And I'm like, yeah, I feel like I remember you being high after these. So I was like, let's just do 4. and it worked out fine. Like it really did. But I don't know how many carbs are in that thing. I really don't. Like I have no feeling for it whatsoever. But I do know that occurred to me that it was about 4 units. And that all comes from the constant feedback from the glucose monitor, being able to see, hey, she ate all this and this is what happened. And eventually you just, it's sort of, you learn without knowing you're learning, I guess.
Right. And the CGM provides you the ability to, if you're wrong, you can find out pretty quickly.
You can miss.
Within an hour or two, you're not going to wait until you have a low blood sugar or blood sugar over whatever your target is. You can start to correct before it gets out of control.
Yep. You can miss and you can correct course on the fly. You don't have to do the old, well, it's been 3 hours. Let me test and see what happened. Oh, 425. I must have not given myself enough insulin. I will now spend the next 5 hours trying to fix this. And, feeling terrible and everything. Yeah, it's a new world. And if this podcast is for one thing, it's for that. Obviously these things get recorded out of order. They get listened to out of order and all that stuff. But I'm going to share something with you, just because it's the conversation we're having, and then we'll get on to more of why you actually are on the podcast. But
sure.
I got a message last night from somebody who I won't identify because they didn't say that was okay. But it says, I just wanted to send you a quick message to say thank you for the podcast. My daughter's endo appointment Monday, her A1C came down from 13.6 at diagnosis to 5.8 in 5 months. I totally believe that's mostly because of listening to the podcast from the beginning saved me from the run high to avoid lows trap and taught me how to use insulin proactively. They're getting a CGM, they're getting an OmniPod, and they're even they're hoping to get those things into a better job even. And then there's a thank you and everything. And here's why I say that. There will be a handful of people who are like, he's saying that because it's a humble brag, but it's not. It's what, and by the way, I'm 45. I shouldn't even know what a humble brag is, but because of this podcast, I have to know. And so, I'm saying that because this basic idea, we're not talking about anything here on the podcast. It's super difficult. It's not rocket science, and I'm not some sort of a diabetes ninja. It's the idea of enough insulin timed correctly. Pretty much the whole thing. You know what I mean? Like it's pretty much the whole thing. So instead of a newly diagnosed person being told, well, but 180's fine for now. We'll figure it out. If she gets up to 250 after dinner, that's okay. We'll get that back. Like, instead of that, someone just reframing what the expectation is and saying, you know what the expectation should be. If your blood sugar starts getting up over 140, you should do something about it. If you're getting high after a meal, you've misbalanced the insulin somehow. Here's how insulin works. Now figure out how exactly it works in you and apply that. These are not things that physicians end up traditionally telling people, because before people could see their glucose values in real time, there was no way to talk about it. Unless you were going to tell them, I need you to test your blood sugar every 15 minutes. And so now that it's changed, we need the advice. And ironically, Owen, nothing that you hear on the Juicebox podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. But when people have those thoughts, those suggestions, or examples of how they do things, you have to be able to, I don't know, there's just, I like the idea of the expectation being changed. And doctors, I'm hoping, will get on board with that, give people the technology that helps them make these decisions, and start them off with, hey, your A1C could be 5.8 5 months from now. Not in a few years, if everything goes well, hopefully we can get you down to the 7s. Like, that's right. Just, I mean, that's what this podcast is for. That's why I do it every week, and it's what I'm hoping for. And when people send these notes, it just tells me, it helps me to keep going. So, because I have to be honest with you, Owen, I'm supposed to be cleaning the carpet in the living room right now. I hope my wife's not listening, but I'm not doing that, as you can tell. We're doing this because I think this is really important. So,
well, I agree. Yeah. So, like I told you on Twitter, like that, I consider this podcast kind of a public service. I mean, I learned a lot from watching a couple of videos from the, I guess, the creator of the open artificial pancreas system.
Yeah,
learned a lot of concepts from that, and but also the podcast here. Since listening to the podcast, I don't know, I heard the idea a few days ago, and I think yesterday or the day before I started doing the actual pre-bolus.
Yeah.
So going back to when I was on regular insulin, I guess Humulin R, you would have to pre-bolus. Like you wouldn't even call it bolusing at the time, but you would just, you knew that the reaction time or absorption time of that insulin was so slow that you would have to take it 15 to 30 minutes before you eat. Last time I was on Humulin R between jobs, which is when it was, generic for, $20 a bottle or whatever. Mm-hmm. At that point, I would take, if my blood sugar was over 200 and I would take Humulin R, it would still be an hour or two before I would eat. And that can be really hard to do sometimes. Yeah. But now that I've got the CGM and I can see what's going on, a couple of major changes that I'm doing now are that instead of scheduling my meal times to be 2:00 in the afternoon for lunch or 8:00 at night for dinner, I'm actually watching my blood sugar, and if I'm not hungry, I'm not going to force myself to eat at a particular time. I'm going to wait till my blood sugar's at the range where it should be, and then 30 minutes before, 15 minutes before, I'll start the bolus for the meal and maybe extend it a little bit if it's going to be a higher bolus, so that it's kind of absorbing the best way.
I find that
I can see the results now. It's incredible. Like before I did this, with having the CGM, I would eat a meal, then take the bolus, then watch the blood sugar ramp up, for a couple of hours and ramp down. Now I'm able to kind of see it bump up just a little bit up to like 130, 140 or so, and stay there or kind of slowly decrease over time.
So
and that's
I am just tickled to hear you say that. I really genuinely am, and it's making me think of the other night I was making just cheeseburgers for dinner. So on the grill, cheeseburgers, and I sliced up some russet potatoes and soaked the starch out of them, and I put them in the oven, and I kind of convectioned them down to sort of baked French fries. Arden came home from school. Her blood sugar was, she's been seeing lows after school. So it didn't look like it was going to happen that day. And so we're like holding out. I'm like, maybe we finally have this right for this new school year. And then all of a sudden it went to 75 diagonal down. Then it was 60. I was like, hey, it's happening, And so she was slow to get to a snack, and then she hit 55 diagonal down, and I was like, you're going to have half a juice because I don't think the snack's going to hit you in time. So she does all that, and I think there was the question of how many cookies should I have, and I think we got lost in translation, and I kept cooking dinner. And then she went over on our sofa, and she settled back into the sofa, and she's doing her homework. Well, she happens to sit... she covers her CGM with her hip. And so it loses connection to the receiver. And so now there's this 30-minute time where everything seems okay because no one's getting any feedback, and it takes 30 minutes to tell you it's lost its signal, which, by the way, I don't want to say that I know anything because I feel like I signed an NDA, but one day you should probably be able to change that 30 minutes down to whatever you want.
That could be fixed.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think all of those time frames on the Dexcom one day will be user adjustable, but that's just me guessing out into the world. Anyway,
you know what? This is a good tangent. One thing you've talked about recently on, because I've listened to the podcast with, I think one of the Dexcom executives or employees, and then also someone from Insulet. And I got to completely agree with you that there should be some level of either like an easy mode versus an advanced mode selection that you can kind of opt in or out of more advanced settings.
Owen, let me say this to make you comforted. Let's speak in the abstract for a second. If a person like me was heard saying things like that to people like them, and say those people were working on stuff like that, let's just say that's me, maybe that person would have been involved in those conversations, and maybe that stuff will happen one day.
Right. They're aware that
it's I would say it's coming, Owen. That's what I would say. Yeah. So
these devices, at this point, they're a kind of a one size fits all.
Yes.
Kind of user interface, and I think there's just maybe a growing recognition, thanks to your podcast, that there are people of different levels of engagement and ability that would like to be able to go in and take more control.
Well, you're kind to give me any kind of credit, but these people are thinking. These people are thinking about these things long before we knew they existed. So it just takes them a while to get to it sometimes. Now, so now that we're in this weird gap where I don't have any feedback from my daughter's CGM, we have significantly overcorrected her low, and I have put food on the grill. I've got stuff in there, and I look down. Food's going to be ready in 20 minutes, and we realize her blood sugar is like 240, 2 up. And I'm just like there's this split second where I would have panicked in the past. I would have been like, no, the food's going to be done in 20 minutes. This is ridiculous. And what I did was I bolused for Arden's meal, and I bolused aggressively to stop the arrows and to bring her blood sugar back down. So I gave her a lot of insulin, let's say, and using the numbers isn't important because everybody's different, but I gave her a lot more than I normally would. And 25 minutes later, she had a big cheeseburger on a roll. She had French fries. I think she put ketchup on the French fries, and she drank a juice box that was low carbs, but not no carbs. And an hour later, her blood sugar was like 170, which was a major win because all that food went in, and we were 240, 2 up, and she got to eat on time and she was not low afterwards. But again, without the CGM and all the experiences that come before, there's no way I get to do that. So
yeah, you're really flying blind without a CGM, and
it's unfortunate
because you're only getting snapshots of where you stand at any given time, and it's really hard to make an educated decision.
Yeah. All right, Owen. So let's tell people why you emailed and what you want to talk about, or why you reached out on Twitter and what it is you want to talk. Do you have a recent experience you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I was curious if you had any guests that talked about their an extended hospital visit before, or any kind of inpatient care at a hospital. Have you had anyone kind of go into that territory?
No one's ever spoken about it, but it's super interesting to me because though I'm adopted, my father, who was my adopted father, in his 70s, had just an injury on his leg. He had type 2 diabetes, and he went into the hospital with an open wound on his leg, and I was fascinated by where they were comfortable keeping his blood sugar. And I tried.
Let me guess. Really high?
Oh my God, really high. And I tried to get him to do something about it, but to be fair, we did not have the greatest relationship. I don't know that he was excited to listen to me. I also think he was older and he was very happy to listen to the hospital. But I kept saying that wound can't heal, if your blood sugar is that high. And I want to say he was dead a week after I said that to him. Now,
wow.
he also had he had congestive heart failure too. But they just left him. I talked to the doctors. I said, really, you should try to get his blood sugar down. Well, we don't want him to get too low. And I was like, but you just came in, he's 280. Like, what do you mean too low? Why don't you make him 180? You know what I mean? Like just take something off of it. But so where were they? What were you are you comfortable saying why you were in the hospital?
Yeah. So I was in an auto accident. I was I was getting back into good health, riding my bike, and went through an intersection with the right of way, and ran into a car. So
and you're like, look, I'm getting my life together, and then bang.
Yeah. I was like, I'm getting 10 pounds. I should lose those 10 pounds, and then bam. Yeah. So
you lost your shoes. That was probably 3 pounds when you got it, right? So okay. So I'm glad you didn't get hurt worse, but you ended up in the hospital for how long?
I was in the hospital. I was an inpatient for 3 weeks.
Wow. What kind of injuries did you have?
My left ankle was shattered, left shoulder was broken, fracture on my wrist. So my left side of my body was kind of in shambles.
How long ago was this?
This was 4 years ago.
Okay.
Like 4.5
Are you doing well now?
Yeah. So I've got metal plates. Everything's recovered, but when the weather changes, you can feel it.
You feel it, yeah. And just before
anytime you got metal in your body.
Before we get to the story, Owen, how do you exercise now? I'm assuming it's not with a bike.
Actually, so I'm not great at exercising. I had started to bike because I live about 2 miles away from work, so I'd started biking to work again because now I've got more sidewalks than I did a year ago. There's been some recent construction here, so I was like, great, I'll do this. But then right as I started to bike to work again, then it started the daytime hours are dwindling, so it gets darker and darker around the time that I leave work. So it's becoming less and less of a practical solution. But the exercise that I find that I can stick with is usually outside of a gym.
Okay.
It's usually riding a bike, but it's problematic.
You're gutsier than I am. I think I have an accident on a bike with a car and end up with a plate in my body anywhere, and I don't even roll anymore. I probably wouldn't touch a cart in the grocery store again. But you're braver than I am. So okay, so you're in the hospital with significant serious injuries.
Yes.
How are you conscious when you come in?
Yeah, so I was conscious the whole time. We'll skip past the resetting of the ankle and all that fun stuff.
Please.
By the time I'm up into whatever floor it was, my leg's in this kind of, cast, or not a cast, but some kind of frame that kind of holds it in place. And there's, constant, morphine and pain medication, and that's going. So you're kind of in a mental state where you're not, like, I was conscious and cognizant, but, in and out of sleep the whole time. But anytime someone would come in and check my blood sugar or dose insulin or whatever, I was aware of that, I think, most of the time. So, and I can still remember kind of what was going on because I started taking notes because it was just that bad. So the hospital, I don't know if this is well, before you mentioned your adoptive father, my assumption was that they were geared more towards treating type 2 diabetics, but maybe that's just not the case. I think it's probably more of just a kind of a aversion to litigation where if someone's blood sugar is high, it's not an emergency and it's not as critical, it's not as time critical to treat as far as a hospital's perspective. I can see the reasoning on that, but when you're diabetic and your blood sugar is over 400 and 500 for a long period of time, it's the worst. It's the worst feeling. I mean, that was almost as bad. I think it actually made the pain of everything else worse as well. because your blood sugar is literally thicker when it becomes that high.
Yeah.
And it just exaggerates everything else that's happening in your body. And so just constantly being dehydrated and thirsty and just feeling awful. I think at some point I had I forget what you call them. I had a lawyer at that point, so they had hired someone to help kind of manage the hospital communications, which, as unfortunate as I was to be in an accident, the silver lining was that I was able to, it was in a situation where I was able to have someone else kind of advocate for me and kind of take care of all the behind the scenes stuff that you shouldn't have to deal with if you're laid up in a hospital bed on pain medication.
Right.
But my blood sugar, they were comfortable leaving it, anywhere over 300 for long periods of time. And I kept asking them. A couple of things are happening there. So at the time, my long-term insulin was Lantus, and I'd used Levemir before, but the reaction times are different, and it has to be dosed differently. They're just two different medications.
Yeah, sure.
And so I knew how to dose myself for Lantus and how to keep everything under better control that way. The hospital only had Levemir, so we had to go through this whole adjustment, while I'm, recovering from an accident. And this was all before even the surgery. But so I had to but then we had to also kind of battle, because I was also, when I was awake, I would read up a little bit on things like Levemir, and I think they were using Humalog or something. But long story short, it was just a matter of I had to kind of combat. I had to actually kind of, I wouldn't say violently, but had to kind of really push repeatedly to kind of not completely take over my diabetes dosing and care, but to get them to treat high blood sugars more aggressively.
And so, did you ever? This is definitely something people should not do, and I'm not saying you should do this, but I've known a couple of people who have had their insulin snuck into hospitals for them by family members, so they could take care of their own blood sugar. But you were probably in fairly bad shape too, right? So,
right,
a lot of pain meds and stuff like that. And
I had some of the medication and stuff with me because it was in my backpack when I was riding.
Yeah,
but I was just being a good citizen and using their stuff. I didn't want to start mixing my insulin with their insulin and making that even more complicated. Because hospitals are basically a very regimented system. So if a patient has this, they're going to get that, and they're going to get this amount of that based on whatever their, if there is any research, based on their research or based on
but basically,
what maybe one person decides that it should be.
They have a process that's very clinical, and then it gets a human face put on it because a nurse or a doctor comes in the room. It's like, what we're going to do, and it feels like it's tailored to you. But honestly, no matter who was laying in that bed, if they had diabetes and they had your injuries, they would have done the same exact thing. There was nothing tailored to you at all. It was this is what we do, and if you weigh this much, and this is how much insulin we're going to give you, and that was pretty much it. And so and so you pushed back aggressively. And did it get to a good point? Did they finally start getting your blood sugar lower, or were you not able to make headway? Did the attorney get involved? What happened?
I think it got better. I think it was still probably more in the upper hundreds and 200s. But even compared, that felt a lot better compared to the 400s and 500s that was going on before that.
Well, did you? I mean, what arguments did you use when you were trying to get them to do better? Like did you tell them I feel horrible?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember a lot of the details of the conversations. I just remember requesting to see a couple of the doctors, a little bit more frequently than they were coming in by default. So I think a lot of the doctors in that scenario are coming in once a day to kind of check up on the previous day and then prescribe whatever's going to happen the rest of the day. And that happens within 5 minutes while they're walking through all the different rooms. So I was starting to request to see, I think I'd maybe requested either an endocrinologist or maybe one of the internists or something. So I started to get a little bit more interaction with doctors at that point because the once a day, adjustments weren't, that's not enough for any diabetic in any situation. Just once a day is not frequent enough.
And once a day facilitated by somebody who doesn't have the first kind of they have no idea how to even handle what they're doing. So it's once a day, not great advice once a day.
Right. But basically, I don't know if they would say this, but they're basically just trying to keep you out of the low blood sugar range.
Yeah, they don't want you to be low.
As long as it's not low, then it's not a problem.
For them.
Right.
For you, it's a bit of an issue.
To be clear, it was definitely a problem for me.
Yeah. And so, wow. Okay, so did that affect your healing process, do you think?
I don't know. I think it got more under control. I was only there for 3 weeks. It seems like the first few days were probably the worst. Went into surgery, got all that taken care of, and then went into physical rehab after that. So, and then at that point, I think I was able to take more control over my, dosing myself and things like that.
Because it would be easy for someone to take a contrarian position here and say, well, if you were semi-conscious, I could see them being concerned about being able to bring a low blood sugar up, but they could give you a glucose drip if you were in trouble. It's not like, and by the way, in trouble is what would we call in trouble? Under 70 and falling,
Right.
They could have gotten you to 120 and held you there. There's and so how much of that I wonder how much of that is effort, how much of that is like what you talked about. They don't want you to get too low because then it becomes an issue. Mm-hmm. It's an emergency. Then a high blood sugar is not considered an emergency. A low one is. They don't. And
you have different body types and different reactions to these things. So,
but still, I think the overreaching lesson here is that when you get into a hospital, you tend to want to think, well, if I'm not safe here, where am I? These people they'll know what to do. And you had such an opposite experience. And I think your experience is very common. I saw it with, like I said earlier, with my dad. I've got friends that have been in the hospital with diabetes. They all tell the same story, that the people there's no concern for keeping their blood sugar in even a reasonable range. Did you feel like it had any long-term effects on you? I guess you're okay now. So
I think it made me more resolved to handle things differently if I ever admitted to a hospital again.
Yeah.
I after this was all over, I had sent a letter to. There were a couple of other things that happened. Before this, I was unemployed, and I don't think this is illegal. Your family members would help you out. My mom's also type 1 diabetic, so occasionally she would help me out, send syringes or insulin. If that is illegal, I have to cut that out.
Let's just say this. That may or may not have happened. We're not saying that definitely happened. We're saying that wouldn't it be nice if a mother helped her? That's all. And so,
yeah.
And plus, we're not using your last name. And I've got a very steadfast resolve. If the coppers show up here, I'll stonewall Mo, and don't worry about it.
All right.
And so it's interesting. So your mom has type 1 also. Do you know how old she was when she was diagnosed?
She was diagnosed about a month after me, actually.
Oh, a solidarity movement.
It was very strange. So yeah, just to go back to that for a second, we didn't have a long history of diabetes in our family. Mm-hmm. I think my mom had a distant cousin who was diabetic, and my dad had a distant cousin, and that's about it. And then, so I was diagnosed after probably a week or two of constant, thirst. And also feeling really bizarre before meals.
Yeah.
Now we know that's low blood sugar probably. Right. And just being fatigued all the time. And so my mom, as a home health nurse, had all the equipment to be able to test your blood sugar and find out what's going on. So at some point I was acting strange enough that she finally Took out the blood sugar meter, said, I'm going to check your blood sugar. And I think from my recollection, maybe this was September 9th, 1996. This was 20 years ago.
As we figured out earlier in the podcast.
We've done the math. We've done the research. I think it took 3 tests. The first test said it was too high. This would have been an old one-touch machine. The second test probably said, 599 or something, whatever the max was. The third test, again, was too high. So we went to the hospital right after that. And I think when they tested it there, it was in the 900s.
Wow.
Yeah. Like really scary high.
Yeah, that's scary. I was going to say Arden's was in the 600s, if I'm remembering correctly, and they told us that they thought she was 24 hours away from a coma. And so you're right on the edge there. And then how much later and your mom's diagnosed?
I think it seems like it was about a month and a half or so. I think it was all the stress. So I'm not sure that I fully understand kind of everything that can trigger diabetes, but
I don't think any of us fully understand all the things.
Maybe it was already happening. I don't know, but right. I think the theory at the time was that the stress had kind of triggered her. Of course, she's already taking care of diabetic patients at this point. Then I become a diabetic, and so she's aware of kind of how to detect different things, and then suddenly she starts to have the same symptoms. I think my dad's mom, I think my grandmother had passed away around this time as well. Mm. So just a lot of stuff kind of happening at once. Yeah. And so maybe this was a couple months after I was diagnosed. And so she eventually, sure enough, became type 1 diabetic, and we've both been diabetic for 20 years.
Oh, that's nuts. That really is crazy. Did she use any of the technology, or have you? Was she there before you, or are you dragging her to it, or is she resist? How's it going?
She had I think she still uses the. Does One Touch have a pump? It's like a Primus or something. Primus is a band.
Primus is a band. It absolutely is. It is. I don't know. Animus.
There's another pump. It's not like a mainstream. It's not one of the top 3, but it's maybe it's the Animus Prime, I think is what it's called.
Okay. I think you're thinking Amazon Prime, but go ahead. No. Which, by the way, for the price is really kind of fantastic. Sometimes I order stuff and it comes the next day. It's really amazing.
Should be sponsored.
But hey, you know what? Oh, and I like the way you're thinking. But so she uses a pump. Have you, I'm interested in this because a lot of people that have diabetes, they know they don't want other people telling them how to handle their diabetes. And at the same time, they're also cognitive. They don't want to tell anybody else. But have you proselytized yet? Have you been like, Mom, I think you maybe need to look at this for the glucose monitor?
Not yet. So I just got the CGM last week.
Oh, you're very new to it.
And I called her yesterday after one of my breaks and was telling her about your podcast. And telling her a little bit of the things I've learned with the CGM. Right. So we only had a few minutes to talk, but I'll be following up with her later, probably this weekend.
What's her name?
Marcia.
Hey, Marcia, what's up? I know you're going to listen to this because your son's on. So
absolutely.
Yeah, that's cool. He's doing a great job. You did a nice job raising him, Marcia. Good for you. Congratulations. He's a nice boy, as they say.
So yeah, she'll probably if the pump that she has doesn't have CGM built in, which I don't think that is possible yet, but I think she'll be researching it.
Yeah.
I'll have to check in and see what her A1C is.
It's just interesting. Like it's an odd, it's an interesting pairing. It's a mother-son. It's the fact that, you're seeing some of this technology before she is, that it's difficult to tell people what to do. Your mom's, I'm assuming in her 50s, older than you, and so it's...
She's in her 20s.
She's in her 20s. Marcia's in her 20s.
She's 29,
that's
always.
Good for her. And as I said, I don't actually remember how old I am, so we're all doing great, and nobody's good at math. We could all be 6 years old. There's no way to tell. But, right. It could be hard to change, and at the same time, maybe you being the advocate for it is helpful. I mean, if you go all the way back to an episode with, I think Anisha from the ADA, and there's a lot of diabetes in her family, and she was, she's at dinners telling people, look what you can do, and some of the family members wanted to hear it and some didn't. And it's interesting. I only have a perspective of, basically what I want to happen with my daughter's management is what happens. I don't, not that, we talk about this a lot and go back and forth. I don't, I've heard people, I've gotten, recently a message like, oh, my daughter doesn't want to do this. And my answer back was, a lot of people would probably disagree with this, but I'm not taking medical advice from an 8-year-old. I don't think you should either. She doesn't want to do it. My kid doesn't want to do like a ton of things, and so, some people will say, hey, well, it's their body. And I'm like, yeah, well, it is, I guess, but I'm responsible for it. So, if you get over the hump, maybe one day the sensor on them isn't something they think about anymore. Maybe it's not, maybe you're going to have a fight. Like, I don't know, maybe the fight's not worth it. There's a lot of maybes, but
I don't think there'll be a fight. I mean, I can say this, the CGM sensor, it seems to be less noticeable than the pump sensor.
Yeah.
The pump
being on you
attachment.
Yeah, I'm now amusingly imagining you holding your mother down, like putting a glucose Mom, I know you don't want to do it, but you got to hold still, and so, you're making it worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, it's just a different perspective. I mean, a son and a mother, and instead of vice versa, I guess. So. Well, good for you, man. This is really cool. Why do you have such a good microphone?
Well, I'm kind of a musician. Also do a podcast with the band that I'm in. So.
Oh, cool. What's the podcast called?
Two Cheers Podcast.
Nice, very nice.
Two Cheers, like TWO, and Cheers, like Cheers.
Like too many cheers?
No. Like 1, 2. Like,
like one.
You've had just enough cheers.
What kind of music do you guys play?
It's kind of what we call like 90s tinged blissed out surf pop rock or something. Is I forget the official description that's on the page.
No, it seems like you've got it down.
Something like that.
You've got your elevator pitch all straight down. So listen, I want to say to people, never don't download my podcast, but once you've listened to mine, go to Owen's and give it a shot. That's cool, man. It was really nice talking to you, and I'm really glad that you reached out. I wondered, I was so afraid that your story in the hospital was going to be what it was, but at the same time, we haven't told it before, and I think it is really valuable to hear. I think people need to be... it's easy to say you need to be your own advocate and things like that. But when you get put in a situation like that, where you feel like there's an authority figure who has control over you, and moreover, it's a person in a position of authority that you've been raised since birth to just sort of step back and listen to. It's hard. It's hard to speak up.
Well, if you're the type of diabetic that's really engaged in taking control over your levels and your diabetes, and you can keep things under control when you're not hospitalized. The thing is, if you're being hospitalized, especially by ambulance, you don't have a choice. You can't just say, well, I'd rather go to this other hospital.
Right.
If there are even more than one hospital around. So, I mean, long story short, I was able to kind of write up a letter with all the things that, suggestions that I had for care for diabetics and things like that, and sent that up to I think one of the people I engaged with at the hospital. And, the only way I would know if anything changed is if I went back and was hospitalized again, which I'm avoiding. But
yeah, try not to run into any more. Have cars run into you. That's definitely a good option moving forward. I think you're smart about that. But no, I just, you know what I mean. Like, it's difficult to speak up, and you have to. And hell, you're only going to be laying around the hospital for 3 weeks anyway. You might as well take good care of your blood sugar. Maybe it's a good time to learn something about it. But it's not like you're doing anything else. I mean, how many times can you watch Judge Judy before you gotta bail? Hey, Owen, would you? I don't know if you can, if the guys in your band would be cool with it or not. But if you share a track with me, like an MP3, I'll stick it in here at the end of the podcast so people can listen to it.
Absolutely, we would love to do that.
Oh, that's so cool. All right, did we not hit anything you wanted to talk about?
Oh, let me go back. I made a list of...
Did you really? Good for you.
Not my first rodeo.
Owen, you'd be horrified at how little I prepare for this podcast.
Oh, well, let's see. I've got too many things. Let me just pick one here.
Oh, go ahead. Roll through it. If you get long, we'll just play the song over you talking.
Just fade me out.
Yeah.
I think you've already talked to people about fighting insurance and some of the artificial and pancreas research stuff that's happening.
Yeah.
What about, all right, here's a good topic I think any diabetic can appreciate. I think we all have weaknesses. Not everyone has a sweet tooth. So my weakness at this point in life is not candy. I'm not going after the Butterfingers and the Snickers and things like that, but I can admit my weakness is ice cream. Mm-hmm. I just can't keep it in the house. It's a problem. So I know that my weakness is ice cream. So if I do want to have ice cream, it's either going to be away from home, so it's just a small serving, or what I do is I get the small serving size ice cream. So either the ice cream cups or like ice cream bars, because those are a known quantity. You're not taking some kind of unknown amount of ice cream whenever you're eating.
Right.
So I wonder if you guys have experience with the particular. You mentioned the iced tea earlier. I don't know if that's a weakness or if it's just like a one-off request.
I think the iced tea for her is just one of those things. Like, it is so different from her daily life, and it's sweet, but it's not too sweet, and it doesn't happen very frequently. And I think it just makes her. I think it's interesting. I think it's got very little to do with diabetes. I think it's that like 12-year-old like standing at a counter ordering a drink from a place where adults get drinks from. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think she just likes it. And so I don't make a big deal out of it. We don't make a big deal out of it. But you are guessing when you're bolusing for it. It's just, because what if she drinks half of it and just stops? Or,
right.
or slams the whole thing down versus sips at it for 45 minutes. It just, there's so many variables. But just don't make a big deal out of it. Does she have any other things that she's like, I really want to have this, and it's one of those things that's difficult to manage? For sure. Like, we don't. There was Chinese food in here in the house the other night, and to celebrate the end of Big Brother. I wish you could see there were little girls in my house watching the last episode of Big Brother eating Chinese food. It was like a school night. I'm like, how did you get everyone to agree? Their parents to agree to let them come out this late on a school night? And she's like, well, it's the end of Big Brother. And I was like, oh. She said it like it was like, well, it's the Olympics. And I was like, yeah, right. And so, there are stuff like that. But, after time and time again, I'm always, and maybe this is good for you to hear, I'm always buoyed by this very simple story that my nurse practitioner told me before we got our first Dexcom CGM. And they were very, very new. It was probably the 7 even before. And I think we started with 7+. But she said she had this patient who their whole goal was to eat M&Ms without their blood sugar spiking. And it took them multiple, days and weeks to figure it out. But eventually they figured out this much insulin at this time. I wait this long. I eat the M&Ms. I don't get any spike. She just told me that, and I thought that opened up a world of ideas in my head. Like, wow, if you could do that, you could do it with everything. And so I think that's the first thing that really like motivated me towards doing that. And that's what makes me think if there's something you have that you have trouble with, if it's ice cream and you want to be gluttonous with ice cream one time, I bet you there's a way to figure it out. I bet you there's a big enough pre-bolus that allows you to eat the first helping and then just lose your mind and go back and get another one where you can add more insulin or more basal and work and make it work. I bet you could work it. I'm now talking you, Owen, into eating poorly and becoming obese.
Well, thanks for the encouragement.
Yeah. Through ice cream, I want you to gorge yourself on ice cream until you can figure out the bolus for it.
Last time I had ice cream was before the CGM, so I'll be able to see I'll be able to see what happens next time I go in on some ice cream.
Let me tell you this seriously, and we're going to wrap up because it's an hour. You figure out that ice cream, and then come back on just for 5 minutes and tell people how you figured it out. And,
all right.
Seriously, we'll put up a 5-minute bonus episode. Owen figured out ice cream, and you can tell people how you did it. But I really appreciate you coming on. This was fantastic, and I wish everybody had your microphone.
It's not too expensive, but yeah, thanks for your podcast too. It's really great. I've learned a lot just over the past week or so that I've been listening. It's really helpful.
I appreciate that. It really is a pleasure to do. So thank you very much for saying that.
All right. Yeah, we could talk for another hour or two, I'm sure, if we didn't have time constraints. But
I think that's the problem. And people will stop listening in another couple of minutes. They'll be like, how long is this going to go? When's the song coming they promised? So, all right, ready, everybody? Here comes the song. What's the song going to be called, Owen?
Let's just go ahead and say we're going to play Fireball.
Fireball.
This is one of the new singles from Two Cheers. It's on Bandcamp, iTunes, Spotify, streaming services. The internet is your friend.
You can find out more about the band at to-cheers.com. There's a link in the show notes. Follow them on Twitter at 2cheersmusic, and they're on Facebook, 2cheers, facebook.com/TWOCHEERS. Thanks so much to Owen and the band for letting us use the music here at the end of the podcast. Huge thank you to our sponsors, OmniPod and Dexcom, for making the podcast possible. Go to my&nbsp.com/juicebox or dexcom.com/juicebox and get started today with what I think is some of the best diabetes technology available. If you're enjoying the Juicebox podcast, please consider going to iTunes and leaving a rating and a review, but most importantly, please consider sharing it with a friend. Finding another person living with type 1 diabetes or a parent of a child with type 1 and let them know, hey, I've been listening to this podcast and it kind of rocks. Maybe you should try it out too. Podcasts are, they're word of mouth kind of things. So we appreciate you sharing. I can tell you this, podcast just crested 150,000 total downloads. I think it's going to hit 200,000 in maybe the next 6 weeks, maybe a little longer. It has definitely doubled and tripled and quadrupled in a very short amount of time. A lot of people hear this every day. And the notes I'm getting back about the podcast are encouraging and heartwarming. And if you are having a similar experience, really, please just share it with somebody else. I'll talk to you soon.